Chapter 1. The First Sign. The quiet town of Veridale rested in the heart of an expansive valley, surrounded by towering mountains that stood like silent sentinels. It had always been a place untouched by the chaos of the world, a place where the mundane ruled and the extraordinary was nothing more than the stuff of whispered stories. Miriam had lived here her entire life, comfortable in the predictability of it all. But the first sign of something wrong appeared in the early hours of a damp autumn morning. It was subtle, barely noticeable at first. A slight flicker in the streetlights that lined the empty road leading to the edge of town. Miriam had been walking her usual path, a quiet stroll she took every morning before the world around her stirred to life. But that morning, there was something in the air. Something that pressed against her chest with an inexplicable heaviness. She continued walking, her feet crunching on the scattered leaves, but her eyes kept darting toward the flickering lights as if drawn to them by an unseen force. At first, she thought it was merely a technical fault, perhaps the result of an old power line beginning to fail under the strain of the cold air. Yet, the lights didn't simply flicker. They pulsed, dimming to a near-extinguishing darkness before flaring up again, as though the town itself was blinking. It happened once, then again, with no discernible pattern, leaving a peculiar unease settling in her gut. By the time she reached the town square, the sensation of being watched began to overwhelm her. There were no people yet. Veridale didn't wake up until the sun fully crested the eastern hills. But the feeling of unseen eyes trailing her every movement grew stronger with every step she took. It wasn't paranoia. It was something more grounded, something real. Her senses heightened as though her body instinctively recognized danger, even if her mind couldn't pinpoint the source. The statue in the town square, an old monument dedicated to forgotten heroes, stood as a landmark that Miriam had passed every day. But today, it felt different. The stone surface appeared darker, as though the shadows clung to it longer than they should, refusing to yield to the soft light of the early morning. She had seen it 1,000 times, yet this morning, it almost seemed to tilt toward her. Her pulse quickened, but she dismissed the thought as irrational. Stone doesn't move. Statues don't watch. Still, there was something in the air. A shift she could almost taste, an odd metallic tang at the back of her throat. She paused before the statue, staring at the figure frozen in its eternal stance, a sword raised high, the face etched with determination. The birds, which typically circled above the square, were absent. The silence was oppressive. Her footsteps echoed louder than usual as she moved away from the square and toward the path that led back to her house. The trees lining the road swayed gently, though no wind accompanied the motion. Every sound seemed muffled, distant, as though she were walking through a place that no longer recognized her presence. Her fingers twitched at her side, a nervous habit she hadn't had since she was a child. It wasn't until she reached the last intersection before home that she noticed the second sign. A single cat, sleek, black, and unblinking, sat in the middle of the road, directly in her path. It stared at her, its golden eyes reflecting something other than curiosity. It felt intentional. The animal remained unnaturally still, its gaze locked on hers in a way that made her skin crawl. Miriam hesitated, unsure whether to continue or to turn back. But turning back felt wrong, as though retreating would open a door to something worse. She stepped forward. The cat didn't move. It simply watched, its body rigid and unnaturally posed. As she drew closer, her footfalls slowed, and she glanced around, half expecting someone to appear from the shadows and explain the bizarre scene. But no one was there. It was just her and the cat, locked in a silent standoff. Her breathing grew shallow. The air felt denser, colder, and she could almost hear a hum beneath the quiet, like the faintest vibration thrumming beneath the earth. With one final glance, Miriam sidestepped the cat, not daring to take her eyes off it until she was far past. It still didn't move, but as she walked away, the weight of its gaze lingered on her, heavy and penetrating, until she turned the final corner. By the time she reached her house, the feeling of dread had settled deeply into her bones. The trees, the roads, the sky, they all seemed slightly off, as though she were moving through a world misaligned with her own. She could feel it in the stillness of her home as she stepped inside, the way the quiet seemed to stretch unnaturally. Miriam stood in the middle of her living room, her breath coming quicker now, though she hadn't realized she'd been holding it. The house felt too quiet, the air inside too stagnant. It was as though the life she had known, the mundane, predictable life, had shifted into something darker, something foreign. She glanced toward the window, half expecting the black cat to be there, its eyes still glowing in the dim light. But there was nothing outside. Her phone lay on the table beside her, its screen dark and lifeless. She reached for it, her fingers trembling, only to find it unresponsive, the power inexplicably gone. She tried again, pressing the buttons with growing frustration. No response. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls growing tighter with every second. Suddenly, a low rumble shook the ground beneath her feet, a faint vibration that felt almost like a distant growl. It wasn't an earthquake, nor was it the sound of a passing vehicle. It was something deeper, something primal. It lasted only a moment, but in that moment, Miriam knew with absolute certainty that whatever had started in the town had followed her home. There was no escape from it now. The first sign had appeared, and it was only the beginning. The feeling of eyes watching her never left. Chapter 2. Miriam's Discovery. The morning sun barely pierced through the heavy clouds that had gathered over Veridale. It was as if the sky itself had thickened overnight, dark and oppressive, casting the town in an eerie, muted light. Miriam woke earlier than usual, feeling an unease that had carried over from the day before, a subtle undercurrent of dread she couldn't shake. The house was cold, colder than it should have been. She slipped out of bed, her feet touching the icy wooden floor, the chill crawling up her legs as she stood. There was something wrong in the air, a heaviness that pressed against her skin. She pulled a thick sweater over her shoulders and glanced toward the window, hoping to find some comfort in the familiar landscape beyond. But outside, everything appeared dull, almost washed out, as if the world had lost its vibrancy overnight. The strange flickering lights from yesterday still occupied her thoughts. Her rational mind wanted to dismiss them as a simple electrical malfunction, but something deeper inside her rejected that explanation. There had been something unnatural about the way they pulsed, as though the very energy of the town was faltering, losing its grip on reality. The memory of the black cat still haunted her, too, its golden eyes boring into her soul like it knew something she didn't. Miriam moved through the house with slow, deliberate steps. The air was thick, and every sound seemed muffled, as though she were wrapped in cotton. Her movements were careful, her senses heightened, as if she were anticipating something to reveal itself at any moment. She couldn't explain the feeling, but the atmosphere around her seemed wrong. She didn't understand how or why, but she knew she had to find out what was happening. Her morning routine offered no solace. The coffee tasted bitter, metallic, and even the scent of it in the air felt out of place. She poured it down the sink, watching the dark liquid swirl and disappear, leaving behind an empty silence. Outside, the sky remained heavy with clouds, casting long shadows over the town as she stepped out onto her porch. The streets were deserted, and the usual morning sounds were conspicuously absent. No birds chirping, no distant hum of cars, just an oppressive quiet that seemed to stretch across Veridale like a suffocating blanket. She walked slowly down the steps, feeling a knot of anxiety tighten in her chest as she surveyed her surroundings. As she made her way toward the edge of town, the same flickering streetlights greeted her again, their faint pulses of light barely illuminating the road ahead. They were malfunctioning more frequently now, the intervals between flickers growing shorter, more erratic. She paused, staring at one of the lampposts as it buzzed faintly, the light sputtering like a candle flame on the verge of dying out. There was something disturbingly alive about the way they flickered, as though the town itself was trying to communicate with her, trying to warn her of something unseen. It wasn't until she reached the town square again that she noticed the change. The statue, the same monument she had passed every day without a second thought, was different. Yesterday, she had sensed something was off, but now it was undeniable. The sword the figure held aloft had changed position. What had once been pointed upward in a heroic stance now pointed downward, aimed at the ground with a menacing intent. The face, once stern but noble, seemed twisted, as though the stone had somehow warped, giving the statue an expression of malice. Miriam's heart skipped a beat as she stared at it, her breath catching in her throat. She took a step closer, unsure of what she was seeing. The stone couldn't have changed overnight. It was impossible. Yet here it was, right in front of her, its cold, unyielding surface seemingly alive with menace. The weight of the gaze she had felt the day before returned, stronger now, suffocating her with an invisible presence. Miriam backed away, her hands trembling at her sides. There was something terribly wrong with the statue, something that defied all logic. She turned her back to it and hurried down the street, her mind racing with questions she couldn't begin to answer. The feeling of being watched lingered, the sensation that the very town was observing her, waiting for her next move. As she made her way toward the outskirts of Veridale, she noticed something even stranger. The air around her seemed thicker, denser, as though it resisted her movements. The road stretched ahead, but it felt longer than usual, the houses and trees lining it fading into the distance in a way that didn't seem quite right. It was as though the landscape itself was shifting, distorting, pulling away from her. Her breathing grew shallow as she continued walking, her legs moving on instinct despite the growing sense of dread in her chest. The horizon, which should have been familiar and comforting, felt distant and unfamiliar. The further she walked, the more the town seemed to blur at the edges, as if it were dissolving into something else entirely. She could feel it now, something lurking just beyond the veil of normalcy, something waiting to reveal itself. She reached the edge of town, where the road narrowed into a single path leading up into the mountains. It was a place she rarely visited, a secluded area where few people ventured. But today, she felt an unexplainable pull toward it, a compulsion to keep walking, to see where the path would take her. The trees along the path loomed overhead, their branches bare and twisted, casting long, crooked shadows on the ground. The air here was colder, sharper, and with each step, the feeling of wrongness grew stronger. Her feet crunched on the leaves beneath her, the sound echoing unnaturally in the silence. As she walked deeper into the forest, something caught her eye, a glint of metal hidden among the trees. She stopped and stared, her pulse quickening as she stepped off the path to investigate. There, nestled in the underbrush, was an old, rusted gate, half buried in the ground and covered in creeping vines. It looked ancient, as though it had been there for centuries, forgotten and abandoned. The gate led to nothing, just a patch of barren earth behind it, with no fence or walls to explain its purpose. But the ground around the gate was wrong. The earth was disturbed, as if something had been dug up and hastily covered again. Miriam knelt down, her fingers brushing against the cold soil, and immediately, a wave of nausea washed over her. The dirt was too soft, too loose. She hesitated, her hands trembling as she began to dig, the loose earth crumbling easily beneath her fingers. What she uncovered made her blood run cold. Beneath the surface, just a few inches down, was a small, stone tablet, engraved with strange symbols that seemed to pulse faintly with an energy she could feel through her skin. The markings were unfamiliar, alien, but there was something deeply unsettling about them. They seemed to radiate an ancient power, something that had no place in the world she knew. She pulled the tablet from the ground, her heart racing as she examined it closely. The symbols twisted and turned as she looked at them, shifting in ways that defied her understanding. They weren't static. They were alive, moving subtly under her gaze, as though responding to her presence. Miriam stood up, clutching the stone tablet tightly, her mind reeling with confusion and fear. She had no idea what she had found, but whatever it was, she knew instinctively that it was connected to everything that had been happening in Veridale. The flickering lights, the strange statue, the unnatural quiet. It was all tied to this, to the ancient, buried secret she had unearthed. As she turned to leave, a low rumble echoed through the forest, the same deep, primal sound she had heard in her home the day before. The ground trembled beneath her feet, and the air grew colder still. She glanced back at the rusted gate, its iron bars now vibrating slightly as if in response to the discovery she had made. Something was awakening, and it had noticed her. With the tablet in her hands and the weight of the unknown pressing down on her, Miriam began to realize that there was no turning back. The first sign had been subtle, but now the pieces were falling into place. Something ancient had been disturbed, and it was only a matter of time before the rest of Veridale felt it too. Chapter 3. In Plain Sight. The tablet sat heavy in Miriam's hands as she trudged back toward town. The air felt thicker now, almost suffocating, like she was walking through a dense fog, though there was nothing visible to obstruct her path. Every step she took felt like wading through a sluggish current, pulling her deeper into a sense of unreality. She clutched the stone tighter, unsure of what she had uncovered, but knowing it was something that shouldn't exist in a place like Veridale. The road seemed longer than it had on her way up, the trees along the path twisting and stretching toward the sky in unnatural patterns. Shadows clung to them like sticky webs, shifting with a subtle wrongness that Miriam couldn't quite place. There was no wind, no sound but the rhythmic crunch of her boots on the leaf-littered ground. Even the distant hum of life, the faint calls of birds, or the rustling of undergrowth, had fallen into a dead silence. The sense of being watched returned, more oppressive now, as though unseen eyes were following her every move. She resisted the urge to look over her shoulder, unwilling to face whatever presence lurked just beyond the edges of her perception. Her chest tightened, and she quickened her pace, the small town in the distance offering no comfort. Veridale appeared unchanged as she re-entered its borders, but there was something subtly different about the way it looked. The streets were still and quiet, but it was more than that. The buildings, the trees, even the pavement. Everything seemed sharper, more defined, as though the edges of the world had been exaggerated. It was as if the town had become hyper-real, a distorted version of itself where every crack in the road and every shadow cast by the dim light had taken on an unnerving clarity. As she passed the statue in the town square again, her breath caught in her throat. The sword had moved once more. What had been a downward thrust aimed at the earth was now pointing directly at the entrance to the square, as if the statue was marking her arrival. The stone figure's face had twisted further, the once stoic expression now contorted into something that almost resembled anger. Its eyes seemed to glare at her as she walked past. A cold shiver ran down Miriam's spine, and she hurried on, unable to shake the feeling that the statue was alive in some way, aware of her presence in the square. She could feel its gaze boring into the back of her head long after she had left it behind. The streets grew narrower as she made her way home, the buildings leaning inward like they were pressing in on her, their windows dark and empty, watching silently. When she finally reached her house, it felt different too. The familiar front porch, the worn steps, and the slightly crooked mailbox that had always greeted her were still there. But the house itself seemed less inviting, more ominous, as if it had been waiting for her to return. She hesitated before opening the door, her hand resting on the handle as she fought the urge to turn and walk away. Inside, the air was stale, colder than it should have been for a late autumn morning. The house had the same lifeless quality she had felt in the town, as though it had been drained of warmth, of familiarity. She closed the door behind her, the sound echoing through the empty space in a way that felt unnatural. The walls seemed closer than before, the shadows deeper, stretching out from every corner. The tablet felt heavier now, its surface still warm despite the chill in the air. Miriam set it down on the kitchen table, stepping back as if expecting it to move on its own. The symbols carved into its surface shimmered faintly, almost imperceptibly, like a pulse, as if the stone itself was alive. She stared at it, her mind racing with the implications of what she had uncovered. The strange, alien markings twisted in ways that defied her understanding. They seemed to shift and change as she watched, their form never staying still long enough for her to truly comprehend them. It was like trying to grasp smoke, the meaning always just out of reach. Yet, there was a pull, an undeniable force drawing her closer to the tablet, urging her to understand. Hours passed as Miriam sat at the table, her eyes fixed on the stone. Time seemed to warp around her, the day outside slipping away into a bleak afternoon without her noticing. The light that filtered through the windows was dull and lifeless, casting long, crooked shadows across the floor. Her mind churned with thoughts she couldn't articulate, fragments of half-formed ideas swirling in a growing vortex of confusion and fear. The rumble that had shaken her earlier echoed again, a low, distant sound that seemed to reverberate through the very bones of the house. The vibrations were faint at first, barely noticeable, but they grew in intensity until the ground beneath her feet trembled. The objects in the room rattled softly, as though responding to some distant force. Miriam's heart raced as she gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the rumbling stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the sound itself, an oppressive stillness that seemed to press down on her from all sides. The air in the room grew even colder, and Miriam's breath came out in short, shallow bursts, her lungs struggling to draw in the thickened atmosphere. The house felt different now, more alien, as though the boundaries between reality and something else had started to blur. She could feel it in the walls, in the floor beneath her feet, in the very air she breathed. Something was changing, something fundamental, and it was centered around the tablet she had brought into her home. Unable to stay inside any longer, she rushed out of the house, the door slamming behind her with a force that startled her. The town outside seemed even more unnatural now, the streets darker despite the fact that evening had not yet fully fallen. The sky above was thick with clouds, but they weren't the typical gray masses of an impending storm. These clouds were darker, almost black, swirling overhead in strange, erratic patterns. Miriam's eyes scanned the street, her instincts screaming at her that she was not alone. Yet, there was no one in sight. The town was empty, its inhabitants either unaware or willfully ignorant of the changes that had taken hold. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as though the unseen force that had been following her since that morning was closing in. Without thinking, her feet carried her back toward the town square, where the statue loomed over the center of Veridale like a sentinel. As she approached, she noticed that the air around the square was different, heavier, more charged with an energy that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. The statue had changed yet again. The sword, once pointing downward, now pointed directly at her. The tip of the blade aligned perfectly with where she stood. The face, now a grotesque mask of rage, seemed to be in motion, as though the stone itself was twisting and warping in slow, deliberate movements. Miriam backed away, her pulse pounding in her ears. There was no doubt now. Something was very wrong with Veridale, and it was happening in plain sight. Yet, no one else seemed to notice. The town itself had become part of the unfolding nightmare, and she was at its center, the unwilling witness to something ancient, something beyond human understanding. As she turned to leave, she felt the weight of the unseen eyes again, stronger now, more focused. The presence was no longer passive. It was aware of her, and it was watching closely. Whatever had been awakened in Veridale was growing stronger, more assertive, and it had set its sights on her. The sky above churned as if in response, the clouds twisting into impossible shapes, forming patterns that seemed to mimic the strange symbols on the tablet she had unearthed. Miriam's breath quickened as she realized the connection. The tablet, the town, the statue. It was all part of something larger, something that had been hidden in plain sight for far longer than she could have imagined. The weight of it pressed down on her as she fled from the square, her feet moving instinctively toward the only place she felt she could find answers. There was no turning back now. The discovery she had made had set things in motion, and the full scope of what lay ahead was still beyond her grasp. But one thing was certain. Whatever was happening in Veridale had been waiting for her. And now, it was too late to stop it. Chapter 4. The Shifting Ground. Miriam's steps faltered as she reached the outskirts of Veridale. The quiet hum of the town fell behind her, replaced by an eerie, unnatural stillness that clung to the atmosphere. The weight of the tablet still loomed in her mind, though she had left it behind on her kitchen table. She didn't need to look at it to feel its presence. It was burned into her memory, an echo she couldn't shake. The path ahead of her led into a dense stretch of woods just beyond the town. As a child, she had spent countless hours exploring this very forest, drawn to its mysteries and secluded clearings. But now, the trees stood taller, more imposing. Their branches tangled together overhead, casting a canopy of shadow that blotted out the evening sky. She couldn't tell where the forest ended and the horizon began. Everything seemed to bleed together in a murky haze. The ground beneath her felt different, not the soft earth she remembered, but something harder, colder, as if the soil had frozen despite the mild autumn air. Each step felt disconnected, as though the earth itself was rejecting her presence. Her boots scraped against the surface, the sound echoing unnaturally loud in the oppressive quiet. She pressed forward, driven by a compulsion she couldn't explain. It wasn't curiosity that drew her deeper into the woods, but something much darker, something that gnawed at the edges of her mind. There was no comfort in this place, no sense of refuge from whatever was happening in the town behind her. In fact, the further she walked, the more she felt as though the trees themselves were watching, their branches reaching toward her like skeletal hands. The path twisted in ways it hadn't before, as though the forest itself was shifting around her. It should have been familiar, but every turn felt wrong, like the landscape was subtly warping with each step she took. Rocks jutted out of the ground in odd places, their surfaces covered in the same strange symbols she had seen on the tablet. The symbols twisted and writhed as if they were alive, etched deep into the stone, yet somehow still in motion. Miriam's pulse quickened as she realized they weren't just carvings. They were part of whatever was infecting Veridale. The forest opened up suddenly into a clearing she didn't recognize. The ground was uneven here, as though something had disturbed the earth beneath. Large, jagged stones protruded from the ground at odd angles, forming a crude circle that seemed both ancient and unnatural. The air in the clearing was heavier, dense with an energy that hummed just beneath the surface of perception. Miriam's skin tingled as she stepped into the circle, the sensation crawling up her arms like a slow burn. She couldn't see it, but she could feel the shift in the atmosphere, as though she had crossed an invisible threshold. The sky above darkened, the clouds overhead thickening into an oppressive blanket that seemed to trap her within the confines of the clearing. The temperature dropped sharply, the breath in her lungs coming out in faint clouds of mist despite the stillness in the air. The stones in the circle seemed to pulse with a low, steady vibration, barely perceptible but unmistakable. Each stone was covered in symbols similar to the ones on the tablet, though these were older, more intricate, as if they had been carved long before the town of Veridale had existed. The symbols seemed to shift as she approached, forming patterns that almost made sense before slipping away again. She knelt by the nearest stone, running her fingers over the markings. The surface was cold, far colder than it should have been. Her skin prickled as she touched the stone, a jolt of something like electricity surging up her arm. She pulled her hand back, her heart racing, but the pulse in the air around her continued, undeterred by her touch. It felt as though the stones were alive, breathing in the same rhythm as the town, as the tablet, connected by some force that she still couldn't fully understand. The ground beneath her feet trembled again, a low rumble that resonated through her bones. The vibrations grew stronger, more insistent, as though the earth itself was coming to life. The jagged stones around her shook, their surfaces gleaming with a dull light that pulsed in time with the vibrations. Miriam's mind raced as the ground shifted beneath her. She had uncovered something much older than the town, something that had been hidden beneath the surface for centuries, waiting to be discovered. The realization hit her with a force that knocked the breath from her lungs. Whatever was happening in Veridale, whatever strange power had taken hold, it wasn't new. It had been there all along, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for someone, waiting for her. As the rumbling grew, the symbols on the stones began to glow with a faint, ethereal light, flickering like embers in the fading dusk. The air around her seemed to ripple, distorting the space within the circle. It felt as though reality itself was bending, warping in response to the ancient forces that had been disturbed. The trees on the edge of the clearing swayed unnaturally, their branches twisting in ways that defied logic, as though they were being pulled toward the center of the circle by some unseen force. The earth beneath her feet shifted again, this time more violently. The ground cracked open, thin fissures snaking through the clearing, radiating outward from the stones. The rumbling intensified, a deep, resonant growl that seemed to rise from the depths of the earth itself. Miriam stumbled back, her mind racing, the pulse of energy in the air growing stronger with every second. The jagged stones shook violently now, their surfaces gleaming with the unnatural light. The cracks in the ground widened, the earth splitting open to reveal something dark and ancient lurking beneath. From within the depths of the fissures, a thick, black mist began to seep, curling upward like smoke. It twisted and coiled, wrapping around the stones, slithering toward her. Miriam's chest tightened as the mist drew closer, its inky tendrils reaching out toward her like fingers. The air grew colder still, freezing in her lungs as the mist engulfed the clearing. She tried to move, but her feet felt rooted to the spot, as though the ground itself had latched onto her, holding her in place. The mist closed in, suffocating her with its cold, oily presence. The stones trembled as the mist wrapped around them, the symbols etched into their surfaces glowing brighter now, their light cutting through the darkness like a beacon. The pulse of energy in the air grew stronger, a steady thrum that seemed to reverberate through every fiber of her being. It wasn't just the stones or the mist, it was everything. The forest, the town, the ground beneath her feet. It was all connected, bound together by this ancient, unseen force that had been waiting for its moment to rise. Miriam's vision blurred as the mist swirled around her, the cold seeping into her bones. The ground beneath her feet shifted again, more violently this time, the cracks widening as the earth groaned beneath the strain. She could feel it now, the presence that had been watching her, following her since she had unearthed the tablet. It wasn't just the town that was changing, it was her. The mist wrapped around her legs, cold and suffocating, pulling her toward the center of the clearing. The ground trembled beneath her, the stones pulsing with a light so bright it was blinding. She could feel the ancient power rising, the force that had been trapped beneath the earth for centuries finally breaking free. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the rumbling stopped. The mist receded, curling back into the cracks in the earth, leaving the clearing in an eerie stillness. The light from the stones faded, the symbols etched into their surfaces dimming to a dull glow. Miriam stood frozen in place, her mind reeling from what she had witnessed. The ground beneath her was still now, the cracks in the earth barely visible. But the sense of unease lingered, the feeling that something had shifted irrevocably, not just in the town, but in the world itself. Whatever had been awakened in Veridale was still there, waiting. Chapter 5. The Breathing Forest. Miriam didn't return to the forest for several days. The weight of what had happened in the clearing lingered, an invisible tether keeping her from venturing back into those woods. It was as though the air in Veridale had grown thicker, laden with something she couldn't quite name. Each morning, the sky hung low and oppressive, the clouds clumping together like bruised flesh, threatening rain but never delivering. The townspeople moved about their days unaware, or perhaps choosing to ignore, the subtle shifts in their surroundings. But Miriam couldn't ignore it. The cracks in the ground haunted her, creeping into her thoughts at every idle moment. She couldn't stop thinking about the symbols, those ancient markings etched into the stones, glowing with that strange, pulsating energy. It was as if the forest had been breathing, exhaling some ancient force that had been dormant for centuries, and now it was wide awake. Her sleep was restless. Each night, she found herself tossing and turning in her bed, the same cold sensation creeping over her skin. In her dreams, the ground beneath her feet would crumble away, revealing an endless void below, where the mist swirled and writhed like a living entity, beckoning her closer. The symbols from the tablet hovered in her mind, dancing in patterns she could almost understand but never quite grasp. She would wake up in the dark, her sheets tangled around her, heart pounding as if she had been running from something she couldn't see. The pull of the forest became too much to resist. One morning, without thinking, she found herself walking back to the edge of town, retracing her steps toward the tree line. The path she had taken before seemed different now, wider, more defined, as though the forest itself had reshaped to make way for her. She hesitated at the entrance, staring into the dense shadows that stretched out before her like an open maw, waiting to swallow her whole. Her pulse quickened as she stepped onto the path, the familiar sensation of the earth shifting beneath her feet returning instantly. It felt like the ground was alive, breathing in time with her movements. Each step sent a tremor through her body, subtle but unmistakable. The forest was awake, and it had been waiting for her to return. As she ventured deeper into the woods, the air grew heavier, thick with the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves. The trees seemed taller than before, their branches twisting together overhead in an intricate web that blocked out most of the light. The dim glow that filtered through the leaves cast strange, shifting patterns on the ground, making it hard to tell where the shadows ended and the earth began. The path beneath her feet twisted in ways that felt unnatural, the familiar trail taking on an almost serpentine quality, winding and curling like the movements of some great beast. The sensation of being watched returned with full force. It wasn't the same as before. This was more intense, more deliberate. It wasn't just the trees watching her now. The forest itself seemed alive, aware of her presence. The ground pulsed beneath her feet, almost imperceptibly, but enough that she could feel it in the soles of her shoes. It was as if the very earth was drawing her deeper, beckoning her towards something hidden within its depths. The clearing appeared sooner than she expected. The stones stood exactly as she had left them, jagged and weathered, their surfaces still etched with those strange, ancient symbols. The cracks in the earth had widened slightly, though they were still shallow enough that the black mist from before hadn't returned. The air in the clearing was unnaturally still, the kind of stillness that made her skin prickle with unease. There was no sound, not even the rustle of leaves or the distant calls of birds. It was as though the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Miriam approached the stones, her heart pounding in her chest. The memory of the last time she stood here was fresh in her mind. The sensation of the ground shifting beneath her, the mist curling around her legs, the symbols glowing with that strange, pulsating energy. She knelt beside the nearest stone and ran her fingers over the carvings. The surface was cold to the touch, far colder than it should have been given the mild autumn air. A faint tremor ran through her hand as she touched the stone, like the distant hum of something vast and unknowable stirring beneath the earth. The symbols didn't glow this time, but they felt alive under her fingers. The markings seemed to shift and pulse with a rhythm all their own, as if they were attuned to something deep beneath the surface of the ground. She stood up and looked around the clearing, her eyes drawn to the center where the cracks in the earth had appeared. Something had changed, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. The air felt different, heavier, as though the weight of the forest was pressing down on her from all sides. The pulse in the ground was growing stronger, more insistent. It was no longer a subtle tremor. It was a steady, rhythmic thrum that reverberated through her entire body. She could feel it in her chest, in her bones, as though the earth itself was alive, breathing in time with her. The sensation was overwhelming, and for a moment, she felt as though the ground beneath her feet might give way entirely, swallowing her whole. Then, without warning, the earth shifted. The tremors grew stronger, and the ground beneath her feet cracked open, the fissures widening with a deep, groaning sound. Miriam stumbled back, her heart racing as the earth seemed to split apart before her very eyes. The cracks snaked out from the center of the clearing, radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel, the ground trembling with a force that felt ancient, unstoppable. From within the fissures, the black mist began to seep again, curling upward like smoke from a dying fire. It was thicker this time, more tangible, and it moved with purpose, coiling around the stones in the clearing, wrapping itself around the jagged rocks like a living thing. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping so suddenly that her breath turned to mist in front of her face. The pulse of the earth grew louder, a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to shake the very fabric of reality. Miriam's skin prickled as the mist curled around her legs, cold and suffocating, pulling her closer to the center of the clearing. The ground beneath her feet trembled violently, the cracks widening as the mist continued to rise. She could feel the pull now, the invisible force that had been drawing her deeper into the forest, compelling her to return to this place. It wasn't just the forest that was alive. It was something beneath the forest, something ancient and powerful, something that had been waiting to be released. The stones began to glow again, the symbols etched into their surfaces flickering with that strange, pulsating light. The mist swirled around the stones, twisting and coiling like a serpent, its tendrils reaching out toward the cracks in the earth. Miriam watched, frozen in place, as the mist pooled in the center of the clearing, seeping into the ground as if being absorbed by the earth itself. The pulse in the ground grew louder, more intense, until it felt as though the very earth was shaking apart. The mist thickened, rising up in great, curling waves, enveloping the entire clearing in its cold, suffocating embrace. Miriam's chest tightened as the mist closed in around her, the cold seeping into her bones, making it difficult to breathe. The pulse of the earth was deafening now, a steady, rhythmic beat that seemed to come from all directions at once. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the tremors stopped. The mist receded, curling back into the fissures in the ground, leaving the clearing in an eerie stillness. The stones dimmed, their glow fading to a dull shimmer, and the pulse in the earth quieted, returning to the faint, barely perceptible hum that had been there before. Miriam stood in the center of the clearing, her body trembling with the aftershocks of what had just happened. The air was still cold, but the oppressive weight that had been pressing down on her seemed to have lifted, if only slightly. She could feel it now, more clearly than ever before. Something was stirring beneath the earth, something ancient and powerful, and it was only a matter of time before it broke free. She turned and walked back toward the edge of the clearing, her mind racing with the implications of what she had witnessed. Whatever was happening in Veridale was far from over. The forest had awakened, and the force beneath it was growing stronger with every passing day. The pulse of the earth had not stopped. It had merely slowed, waiting for the moment when it would rise again. And when it did, Miriam knew there would be no stopping it. Chapter 6. The Buried Path. The morning came thick with fog, draping the landscape in a heavy gray blanket. The fields surrounding Veridale were barely visible, the tops of the trees rising like skeletal hands grasping at the mist. Miriam's limbs felt weighted as she moved through her small cottage, her body sluggish from another night of restless sleep. She could no longer tell where her waking life ended and the dreams began. They had begun to blend together, the forest invading her thoughts even in the few moments of stillness she found. Despite the dread that clung to her, she knew she had to return to the clearing. There was something there, something she had to understand. The forest's grip on her had tightened since her last visit. It no longer felt like a place to be feared, but a place she belonged to, a place that wanted her. The pulse of the earth, that subtle vibration, now seemed to follow her wherever she went, even in the quiet of her own home. The path to the forest was colder today. The fog swirled around her feet, clinging to the ground like a living thing, unwilling to let go. Her boots crunched through the brittle leaves, the dampness of the air soaking into her skin. The farther she walked, the more the fog seemed to thicken, swallowing up the world behind her. The trees loomed larger as she approached, their dark shapes emerging from the mist like sentinels standing guard. She hesitated at the entrance, the familiar sensation of being watched creeping over her again. The forest was different now. The air felt denser, almost electric, as though something was building beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The pulse in the ground was stronger today, vibrating through the soles of her shoes as if it were trying to communicate with her. With a deep breath, she stepped into the trees, the fog thickening around her as she moved deeper into the woods. The silence was absolute. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, no distant sounds of the town. Just the steady thrum of the earth beneath her feet. It was as though the forest had sealed itself off from the rest of the world, a place that existed outside of time, outside of reality. The path twisted and turned in unfamiliar ways. The trees seemed closer together, their branches entwining overhead like a canopy of knotted limbs, casting deep shadows across the ground. Miriam kept her eyes forward, her pace steady, though every step felt heavier than the last. The air grew colder as she walked, the mist swirling thickly around her ankles, and that ever-present pulse grew louder, reverberating through her body. The clearing appeared suddenly, as if the forest had drawn it out of the fog. The stones stood in the center, just as they had before, though something felt different. The earth beneath her feet seemed to shift, almost imperceptibly, as if it was aware of her presence. The cracks in the ground were wider now, spidering out from the center of the clearing, their edges jagged and sharp. The black mist she had seen before seeped from the cracks, thicker now, rising in slow, curling tendrils that twisted around the stones like smoke from a fire. Miriam approached the stones cautiously, her eyes drawn to the strange markings etched into their surfaces. The symbols glowed faintly, a dull shimmer that pulsed in time with the rhythm of the earth. She knelt beside one of the stones, her fingers brushing over the cold surface, tracing the lines of the symbols. They felt alive, vibrating with a quiet energy that seemed to hum beneath her fingertips. As she stood up, the ground beneath her feet shifted again, a deep, rumbling tremor that made her heart race. The cracks in the earth widened with a groaning sound, the fissures snaking outward from the center of the clearing, black mist pouring from the ground in thick, roiling clouds. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping so quickly that her breath formed in small puffs of mist in front of her face. Something was happening beneath the earth. She could feel it now more clearly than ever before. The pulse of the forest, that steady rhythm, had grown stronger, more insistent. It was as if the forest itself was trying to push something to the surface, something that had been buried for centuries, waiting for the right moment to rise. The mist curled around her legs, cold and suffocating, pulling her closer to the center of the clearing. The stones began to glow more brightly, their symbols flickering with a strange, pulsating light. Miriam's heart pounded in her chest as the mist thickened, swirling around her in great, roiling waves, filling the air with a heavy, suffocating pressure. She could feel it pressing down on her, the weight of the forest, the weight of whatever was beneath the ground, growing heavier with each passing moment. The pulse in the earth was deafening now, a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to come from all directions at once. The mist continued to rise, swirling around the stones, its tendrils reaching up toward the sky as if trying to grasp at something just beyond reach. The ground beneath her feet trembled violently, the cracks in the earth widening with a deep, guttural groan. And then, suddenly, the earth split open. The ground beneath her feet gave way, the fissures spreading outward in jagged lines that snaked across the clearing, the black mist pouring from the cracks in thick, roiling clouds. The stones glowed with a blinding light, their symbols flickering and pulsing in time with the rhythm of the earth. Miriam stumbled back as the ground beneath her feet crumbled away, her heart racing as the mist swirled around her, cold and suffocating. The pulse of the earth grew louder, more insistent, until it felt as though the very fabric of reality was tearing apart. The mist thickened, rising up in great, curling waves, enveloping her in its cold embrace. The ground beneath her feet shifted again, the tremors growing stronger as the earth continued to split apart. The black mist rose higher, swirling around the stones, its tendrils reaching out toward the sky. The pulse of the earth was deafening now, a steady, rhythmic beat that seemed to come from all directions at once. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the tremors stopped. The mist receded, curling back into the cracks in the earth, leaving the clearing in an eerie stillness. The stones dimmed, their glow fading to a dull shimmer, and the pulse in the earth quieted, returning to the faint, barely perceptible hum that had been there before. Miriam stood in the center of the clearing, her body trembling with the aftershocks of what had just happened. The air was still cold, but the oppressive weight that had been pressing down on her seemed to have lifted, if only slightly. She could feel it now, more clearly than ever before. Something was stirring beneath the earth, something ancient and powerful, and it was only a matter of time before it broke free. The forest had not finished with her yet. Chapter 7. The Silent Descent. The days following the event in the clearing passed in a fog of disorientation. Miriam found herself drifting through her routines as if her body were on autopilot, but her mind was anchored somewhere deep beneath the surface of the earth, where the pulse of the forest never stopped. The quiet hum of her small cottage, once comforting, now felt alien. The walls seemed to close in on her, the air growing thicker, making it hard to breathe. She no longer felt at home, even in her own skin. The night after the tremors, she had returned home, her body weak and trembling, barely able to climb into bed. Sleep had not come easily, if at all. Her dreams were now plagued by images of the clearing, of the stones glowing with an otherworldly light, of the black mist curling out of the earth like smoke from some long-forgotten fire. She would wake in a cold sweat, the pulse of the earth still echoing in her ears, as if it had followed her home. But it wasn't just in her dreams anymore. The pulse was there in the waking world, too, soft but ever-present, like a distant drumbeat that she couldn't quite tune out. She would feel it in the floorboards of her cottage, in the air as she walked through the village, even in the ground when she stepped outside. It was as if the forest had reached beyond its borders, its roots spreading beneath the town, beneath her very feet. The townspeople didn't seem to notice. They went about their lives with the same steady rhythm, unaware of the creeping dread that had taken root in her. Miriam kept to herself more now, feeling like an intruder in her own community. Every person she passed seemed distant, out of focus, their faces blurred as though they were merely shadows passing by. Her days were spent in a haze of exhaustion, each hour dragging on as she tried to push the pulse out of her mind. But it was futile. She knew she was being drawn back to the forest, whether she wanted to return or not. It called to her with a quiet persistence, the rhythm of the earth like a lure, pulling her deeper into its web. By the third day, she could no longer resist the pull. The forest had become more than a fixation. It was a necessity, an instinct she could no longer ignore. She had to return, had to understand what had happened in that clearing, had to uncover what was buried beneath the earth. The forest wanted something from her, and the more she resisted, the stronger its grip became. She left her cottage before dawn, the sky still a deep shade of indigo, the air cold and damp with the morning mist. The village was silent as she passed through, her footsteps the only sound breaking the stillness. There were no lights in the windows, no movement in the streets. It was as if the entire town was asleep, oblivious to the growing darkness that surrounded them. The path to the forest seemed longer this time. The fog clung to her legs as she walked, the air growing colder the closer she came to the treeline. Her breath came in shallow bursts, her heart pounding in her chest as though it were trying to match the rhythm of the pulse beneath the earth. She could feel it now more than ever, that steady beat, like the heartbeat of something ancient and powerful, just waiting to emerge. The forest greeted her with the same eerie silence as before. The trees stood tall and unmoving, their branches hanging low as if they were bowing to some unseen force. The path beneath her feet felt different, softer, as though the ground had been disturbed in some way. The fog thickened as she stepped deeper into the woods, swirling around her in slow, curling tendrils, obscuring the world around her. The pulse grew stronger as she walked, the rhythm more insistent now, almost frantic. The forest felt alive in a way it hadn't before, the air charged with an electric energy that made her skin tingle. The trees seemed to close in around her, their shadows stretching longer, their trunks leaning inward as if they were trying to guide her toward something. The clearing appeared before her once again, but this time it was different. The stones stood in the center, but they no longer glowed with the faint light she had seen before. Instead, they were dark, their surfaces cracked and jagged, as though something had shattered them from within. The black mist still seeped from the cracks in the earth, but it was thinner now, almost transparent, as if it had lost some of its power. Miriam stepped forward cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. The ground beneath her feet felt unstable, shifting slightly as though it were ready to give way at any moment. She could feel the pulse of the earth beneath her, stronger than ever, vibrating through the soles of her shoes and into her bones. It was almost unbearable now, the rhythm so loud it drowned out all other sound. As she reached the center of the clearing, the ground trembled beneath her, a low, rumbling groan that sent a shiver down her spine. The cracks in the earth widened, black mist pouring out in thick waves, swirling around her in a suffocating cloud. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly until her breath came in sharp, freezing bursts. The pulse of the earth grew louder, more insistent, as though something was trying to break free from beneath the surface. The mist thickened around her, rising higher and higher until it blocked out the sky, casting the clearing in a deep, impenetrable shadow. She could feel it now, something stirring beneath the earth, something ancient and powerful, waiting to be released. The ground trembled again, the cracks widening as the mist continued to pour out in thick, roiling clouds. The stones at the center of the clearing began to glow once more, their symbols flickering with a faint, pulsing light. The pulse of the earth matched the rhythm of the glowing symbols, each beat sending a tremor through the ground beneath her feet. Miriam's heart raced as the ground began to shake more violently, the stones glowing brighter with each passing moment. The mist swirled around her in great, curling waves, pulling her closer to the center of the clearing. The pulse of the earth was deafening now, a steady, rhythmic beat that seemed to come from all directions at once. And then, without warning, the ground split open beneath her feet. Miriam stumbled, her body lurching forward as the earth gave way beneath her. The mist rushed in around her, cold and suffocating, pulling her down into the darkness. She reached out, her hands grasping for something solid, but there was nothing. Only the black mist, thick and heavy, swallowing her whole. The last thing she felt before the darkness consumed her was the pulse of the earth, steady and unyielding, as though it had finally claimed what it had been waiting for. Chapter 8. The Descent Below. The darkness was complete. There was no sense of time, no feeling of movement, just an overwhelming nothingness. Miriam was lost in the void, the black mist swirling around her like a shroud. The pulse of the earth remained, steady and inescapable, its rhythm reverberating through the emptiness, grounding her in this otherwise formless space. She floated, weightless, disconnected from her body, her mind struggling to hold on to any shred of reality. There were no sounds but the faint thrum of the pulse beneath her, no light to guide her, only an endless, suffocating blackness. The world she had known above, the forest, the stones, even the town, felt like a distant dream, fading away with each passing second. Slowly, a sensation began to return. The cold was the first thing she noticed. It was sharp, biting, a cold that seeped into her bones and froze her breath in her lungs. Her limbs felt heavy, sluggish, as though she were sinking deeper into the earth itself. The mist clung to her skin, wet and clammy, dragging her down into the depths of the unknown. It was then she realized she was no longer floating. The ground beneath her had reappeared, solid and unyielding, though it felt different, softer, more malleable, as if the very earth had transformed into something foreign. Her body felt compressed, as if the weight of the world above had settled on her shoulders, pressing her deeper into the soil. Miriam's vision remained cloaked in darkness, but her senses began to sharpen. The pulse of the earth was stronger here, more immediate, as though she had drawn closer to its source. Each beat echoed through her, vibrating in her chest, a steady reminder of the power that lay beneath. She could hear it now, the rumbling of the ground, the subtle shifts in the earth as it moved around her. It was alive, a living thing, ancient and incomprehensible. As her body adjusted to the crushing pressure around her, her vision began to clear, the thick black mist parting just enough to reveal the faintest of glows. It was distant, a dull shimmer barely visible through the fog, but it was there, a sliver of light in the all-encompassing darkness. The ground beneath her feet was cold and soft, like a bed of damp, rotting leaves, and with every step, she felt as if she were walking on a surface that could give way at any moment. She began to move toward the glow, her steps slow and cautious, her heart pounding in time with the pulse of the earth. The light grew stronger as she approached, its glow faint but steady, illuminating the space around her in a sickly, greenish hue. The ground shifted beneath her feet, the soil soft and pliable, as though it were alive, pulsing in time with the rhythm beneath the surface. The mist thinned as she drew closer to the light, revealing a vast underground cavern. The ceiling stretched high above her, disappearing into the darkness, while the walls were lined with strange, pulsating roots that snaked across the surface like veins. The light emanated from the center of the cavern, where a massive stone stood, similar to the ones in the clearing above but much larger, its surface covered in intricate symbols that glowed with the same eerie light. The pulse of the earth was strongest here, its rhythm vibrating through the stone, sending ripples through the ground that seemed to resonate with the very core of the earth. Miriam felt a strange pull toward the stone, as though it were calling to her, beckoning her closer. Her feet moved of their own accord, drawn toward the glowing symbols, the cold air growing thicker with each step. As she approached the stone, she noticed the ground beneath it was different from the rest of the cavern. It was softer, darker, as though something had disturbed the earth here long ago. The black mist seeped from the ground around the stone, swirling in slow, deliberate patterns as if it were alive. The symbols on the stone flickered with an unnatural light, their glow pulsating in time with the beat of the earth beneath her feet. Miriam knelt before the stone, her fingers trembling as she reached out to touch its surface. The moment her skin made contact with the cold, smooth stone, a shock of energy surged through her, the pulse of the earth rushing through her veins, filling her with a sense of connection she had never felt before. The ground trembled beneath her, the mist swirling faster, rising in great curling waves that enveloped the cavern in a suffocating cloud. The symbols on the stone glowed brighter, their light growing more intense with each passing second. The pulse of the earth quickened, its rhythm more frantic now, as though something was about to break free from beneath the surface. The ground beneath the stone shifted, the soft earth churning as though something was trying to push its way to the surface. And then she saw it, a faint outline, barely visible through the mist, emerging from the earth beneath the stone. It was a figure, tall and gaunt, its form twisted and unnatural, as though it had been buried for centuries. The mist curled around it, clinging to its body like a second skin. As it slowly rose from the ground, its movements slow and deliberate. Miriam's breath caught in her throat as the figure stepped forward, its body still shrouded in mist, its features obscured by the darkness. The pulse of the earth grew louder, more insistent, as though it were pushing the figure toward her, urging it to break free from its prison beneath the ground. The mist thickened around the figure, its tendrils wrapping around its limbs, pulling it forward with each step. The figure stood before her now, its presence overwhelming, the air around it thick with the stench of decay. Miriam could feel the pulse of the earth in her chest, each beat sending a shockwave through her body, as though the earth itself was trying to warn her, trying to tell her to turn back before it was too late. But she couldn't move. Her body was frozen in place, her limbs heavy and unresponsive, as though the mist had wrapped itself around her, holding her in place. The figure raised its hand, the mist swirling around it in great, curling waves, and placed it on the stone. The symbols glowed brighter, their light pulsating in time with the rhythm of the earth. The ground trembled beneath them, the pulse of the earth growing louder, more frantic, as though something was about to break through the surface. The figure's hand pressed harder against the stone, its body trembling as the symbols flickered and pulsed. The earth beneath them shifted, the ground churning and roiling as though something was rising from the depths below. The mist thickened, curling around the figure's body, pulling it closer to the stone, as the pulse of the earth reached a deafening crescendo. And then, with a final, violent tremor, the ground split open. The mist rushed in, swirling around the stone in a great, roiling cloud, enveloping the cavern in an impenetrable darkness. The pulse of the earth grew silent, the rhythm stopping abruptly, leaving only the sound of the mist swirling through the air. Miriam was alone, standing before the stone, the figure gone, the mist swirling in slow, lazy spirals around her. The pulse of the earth was silent now, but she could still feel it, deep beneath the surface, waiting. Chapter 9. The Hollow Core. The silence after the pulse vanished was almost unbearable. It filled the cavern like a thick blanket, pressing down on Miriam as she stood motionless before the now lifeless stone. The once familiar thrum of the earth, which had permeated every moment since her descent, was gone, leaving a void so profound it seemed to rob the world of meaning. There was no longer any rhythm to the air, no beat beneath the ground. Even her own heartbeat felt disjointed, lost in the emptiness. Miriam's body felt numb, her limbs heavy as if weighed down by invisible chains. The mist that had filled the cavern with its suffocating presence had receded, leaving only thin wisps curling along the floor, as if reluctant to fully depart. The great stone that had once pulsed with light and energy now sat dormant, its surface dull and cracked, the intricate symbols carved into it dark and lifeless. For a long time, she remained there, staring at the stone, her mind blank. She knew something had changed, something far deeper than the absence of the pulse or the mist. The air itself felt different, as though the very atmosphere of the cavern had shifted, become denser, more oppressive. The cold that had seeped into her bones earlier remained, but now it was different, more biting, as though it came not from the cavern around her, but from something deeper, something buried far below. The ground beneath her feet felt strange now, less stable than before. It shifted ever so slightly, a soft tremor that echoed through the soles of her shoes. The earth felt hollow, as though a great emptiness had opened up beneath the surface, stretching downward into the unknown. It was as if the pulse that had once filled the earth had been the only thing keeping it solid, and now that it was gone, the ground had lost its substance. With slow, deliberate movements, Miriam turned her gaze away from the stone and toward the rest of the cavern. The walls, once lined with strange, pulsating roots, were now bare, their surfaces smooth and unremarkable. The roots had withered, their tendrils curled and brittle, as if they had been drained of whatever force had once animated them. The cavern felt dead now, as though it had been stripped of its vitality, its energy sucked dry by whatever had risen from the earth. A sense of unease settled over her as she took a cautious step forward, her foot sinking slightly into the soft ground. The sensation of hollowness grew stronger with each step, as though the floor of the cavern was nothing more than a thin crust, fragile and unstable. Her instinct screamed at her to turn back, to leave the cavern before it was too late, but something held her in place, an unseen force that pulled her deeper into the space, urging her to continue. Her footsteps echoed faintly in the silence as she moved away from the stone, her eyes scanning the cavern for any sign of the figure that had risen from the earth. But there was nothing. No trace of the entity remained, no mist or shadow to mark where it had been. It was as if the figure had never existed, as if it had been nothing more than a hallucination conjured by the pulse of the earth. But Miriam knew it had been real. She had felt its presence, its weight, the oppressive air that had filled the cavern when it had emerged. And now, even though the figure was gone, she could still feel its lingering influence, a faint pressure on the edges of her consciousness, like a distant whisper she couldn't quite hear. The cavern stretched on before her, vast and empty, its boundaries lost in shadow. The further she walked, the darker it became, the faint green glow from the stone fading into nothingness. The air grew colder, each breath a sharp stab in her lungs, the chill biting through her clothes. The ground continued to tremble beneath her, the hollow sensation deepening with each step, as though she were walking on the surface of something fragile, something that could shatter at any moment. And then she felt it, a faint vibration beneath her feet, different from the pulse of the earth. It was softer, more subtle, like the faintest of tremors, barely perceptible. But it was there, unmistakable, a new rhythm, weaker but present. It was not the steady beat she had grown accustomed to, but rather a distant, irregular thumping, as though something far below the surface was stirring, struggling to break free. Miriam paused, her heart racing as she knelt down and pressed her hand to the ground. The surface was cold and soft, almost spongy beneath her fingers, but the vibration was stronger now, more insistent. It pulsed through her hand and up her arm, a faint but steady reminder that whatever lay beneath the surface had not been fully silenced. Something was still there, deep below the earth, waiting. The realization sent a shiver down her spine. The pulse had not vanished. It had merely changed. Whatever force had been keeping it in check had been disrupted, and now it was free to grow, to spread. The figure had not been the end of this strange nightmare. It had merely been the beginning. Something far older, far more dangerous, had been awakened. With a sudden surge of urgency, Miriam rose to her feet and began to move quickly through the cavern, her footsteps silent on the soft ground. The tremors beneath her grew more pronounced as she moved, the vibrations spreading through the earth like ripples in water. She could feel the air growing heavier, the cold intensifying, as though the deeper she ventured, the closer she came to the source of the disturbance. The walls of the cavern seemed to close in around her as she walked, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The ceiling, once high and distant, seemed to lower, the shadows above her growing thicker, more oppressive. The ground shifted beneath her feet with every step, as though the earth itself was beginning to buckle under the strain of whatever was stirring below. And then, without warning, the ground gave way. Miriam fell, her body plummeting through the air as the earth crumbled beneath her. The fall seemed to last forever, the darkness swallowing her whole as she tumbled through the void. The sensation of weightlessness returned, the cold air rushing past her as she descended deeper into the earth, her limbs flailing helplessly in the darkness. And then, with a bone-jarring thud, she landed. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs, leaving her gasping for breath as she lay sprawled on the ground. The darkness was absolute now, the faint glow from the cavern above completely gone. The air was thick with the stench of decay, a rancid odor that made her stomach turn. The ground beneath her was no longer soft and pliable, but hard and cold, like stone. Slowly, painfully, Miriam pushed herself to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the faint sound of her own ragged breathing. She could feel the weight of the earth pressing down on her, the walls of the cavern seeming to close in around her, trapping her in this suffocating space. But the vibrations were stronger now, more insistent, as though whatever lay beneath the surface was closer than ever. The pulse of the earth had returned, faint but unmistakable, its rhythm erratic and chaotic, like the heartbeat of something vast and ancient, something struggling to break free. And Miriam realized with a chilling certainty that she was no longer an observer. She was part of it now, bound to the pulse, the hollow core of the earth beneath her feet waiting to swallow her whole. Chapter 10. The Forgotten Passage. The darkness that enveloped Miriam was thick and oppressive, a stifling presence that seemed to press down on her from all sides. The fall had left her disoriented, her sense of direction lost in the impenetrable blackness. The air was heavy, tinged with a musty odor that hinted at long-forgotten decay. She could feel the cold seeping into her bones, the chill of the earth that surrounded her. She took cautious steps forward, her hands outstretched in front of her, feeling the ground for any sign of stability. Each step was slow and deliberate, the hard, cold surface beneath her feet crunching softly as she moved. The vibrations from earlier had subsided, leaving only the faint echo of her own movements in the silence. As she walked, her fingers brushed against the rough texture of the walls. They were cold and unyielding, coated with a layer of dust and grime. The walls seemed to close in around her, their surfaces irregular and uneven, as though they had been hewn from the earth in a haphazard manner. The sense of confinement grew stronger with each step, the space feeling increasingly claustrophobic. Miriam continued to explore, her footsteps echoing softly through the darkness. The ground beneath her remained firm, a stark contrast to the soft, shifting earth of the cavern above. The cold seemed to seep into her very core, her breath forming small clouds in the air as she exhaled. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of her own breathing and the occasional distant rumble, like the echo of thunder far below. As she moved forward, she noticed a faint, irregular light flickering in the distance, barely perceptible through the darkness. It was a soft, ghostly glow that seemed to emanate from a crack in the wall ahead. The light was pale and weak, but it offered a glimmer of hope in the otherwise oppressive gloom. Miriam quickened her pace, her steps more determined as she approached the source of the light. The crack in the wall widened as she drew closer, revealing a narrow passageway that stretched into the darkness. The light came from beyond the passage, a faint, pulsating glow that seemed to beckon her forward. The passage was narrow and uneven, its walls lined with strange, luminescent markings that flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows on the ground. Miriam hesitated for a moment, her gaze fixed on the passage. The glow beyond seemed inviting, a promise of something more, something that might offer answers to the strange occurrences she had witnessed. With a deep breath, she steeled herself and stepped into the passage, the walls closing in around her as she moved. The passage was cramped, forcing her to navigate with her shoulders brushing against the walls. The air was cooler here, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat of the cavern above. The glow from the markings on the walls was more pronounced now, their light casting an otherworldly illumination on the narrow space. The markings were intricate and foreign, their patterns shifting and changing as she moved, creating an ever-evolving tapestry of light and shadow. Miriam continued down the passage, her steps careful and deliberate. The ground was uneven, with occasional protrusions and dips that made her footing treacherous. The walls seemed to close in tighter as she progressed, the passage narrowing further until she could barely squeeze through. The glow grew brighter, the pulsating light illuminating the passage in a soft, ethereal glow. As she rounded a bend in the passage, she found herself in a small chamber. The space was dimly lit by the light from the passage, the glow reflecting off the walls and casting long, flickering shadows. The chamber was empty, save for a large, ancient-looking door set into one wall. The door was ornate, covered in intricate carvings and symbols that matched the markings on the walls of the passage. It was slightly ajar, a narrow gap revealing a sliver of the light beyond. Miriam approached the door cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. The air around the door was colder, the chill more pronounced as she drew closer. She reached out and pushed the door gently, the creak of the hinges echoing loudly in the silence. The door swung open slowly, revealing a vast, dimly lit room beyond. The room was immense, its ceiling lost in shadow, the walls lined with strange, ancient symbols that glowed softly in the darkness. The floor was covered in a layer of dust, and scattered around were remnants of long-forgotten artifacts, broken pottery, ancient scrolls, and shattered remnants of once grand furnishings. The light in the room was soft and diffuse, coming from a series of small, glowing orbs that floated in midair, casting an eerie illumination on the surroundings. In the center of the room stood a large stone altar, similar in appearance to the one in the cavern above. The altar was covered in intricate carvings and symbols, its surface worn smooth by the passage of time. Surrounding the altar were 4 tall, slender pillars, each adorned with glowing runes that pulsed in time with the faint rhythm of the earth. The air was thick with an ancient, musty odor, and the atmosphere was heavy with a sense of foreboding. Miriam approached the altar, her gaze fixed on the strange symbols that covered its surface. The carvings seemed to shift and change as she looked at them, their meanings elusive and indecipherable. The faint glow from the orbs provided just enough light to reveal the intricate details of the altar, but the darkness beyond remained impenetrable. As she examined the altar, she noticed a series of small grooves carved into its surface. The grooves formed a pattern, resembling a map or a chart of some kind. They seemed to lead toward a central point, where a small, ornate object rested, a pendant, its surface adorned with the same intricate symbols that covered the altar. Miriam reached out and picked up the pendant, its weight cool and solid in her hand. The moment her fingers touched it, the room seemed to shudder, a faint tremor running through the floor. The glowing orbs flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. The pendant was intricately carved, its surface covered in a network of symbols that pulsed gently with the same eerie light that had illuminated the passage. As she held the pendant, she felt a strange sensation, a subtle vibration that seemed to resonate with the rhythm of the earth. It was as if the pendant was a conduit, channeling the ancient energy that flowed through the room. The sensation grew stronger, the vibrations becoming more pronounced, until they seemed to echo through her entire body. The room was filled with a low, rumbling sound, the vibrations intensifying until they were almost deafening. The pillars surrounding the altar began to glow more brightly, their runes pulsing in time with the rhythm of the earth. The orbs floating in midair flickered and danced, their light casting shifting patterns on the walls. Miriam clutched the pendant tightly, her heart racing as the room seemed to come alive with energy. The carvings on the altar glowed more brightly, their symbols shifting and changing in a mesmerizing dance of light and shadow. The air grew warmer, the oppressive chill of the cavern replaced by a strange, comforting heat. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the energy in the room began to dissipate. The vibrations faded, the rumbling sound dwindling to a soft, distant echo. The pillars' glow dimmed, and the floating orbs settled into a gentle, steady illumination. The pendant's light remained steady in her hand, its pulse now in sync with her own heartbeat. Miriam stood in the center of the room, the pendant glowing softly in her grasp. The room had returned to its former state of quietude, the eerie sense of foreboding replaced by a strange sense of calm. The artifacts scattered around the room seemed unchanged, the remnants of a forgotten era preserved in the dust. She took a deep breath, the warmth of the room a welcome contrast to the cold of the cavern above. The pendant was a tangible connection to the energy that flowed through the ancient space, a key to understanding the mysteries that lay hidden beneath the surface. As she stood there, the weight of the pendant in her hand felt like a promise of answers, of revelations yet to come. The passageway from which she had come remained dark and uninviting, but the light from the orbs provided a small measure of comfort. The room was a haven of sorts, a place of ancient power and forgotten knowledge. The ancient symbols on the altar and the pendant in her hand were clues to a deeper mystery, a riddle waiting to be solved. With renewed determination, Miriam turned her gaze back to the passage, ready to explore the unknown and uncover the secrets that lay hidden in the darkness. Chapter 11. The Echoing Abyss. The soft, ambient light from the glowing orbs cast long shadows on the walls of the ancient chamber, flickering and shifting as Miriam moved cautiously toward the passageway leading further into the depths of the unknown. The pendant, still glowing gently in her hand, provided a reassuring warmth against the coolness of the chamber. It seemed to resonate with the energy in the room, the faint pulses of light in sync with the rhythm of her own heartbeat. Miriam's steps were slow and deliberate, each footfall echoing softly through the quiet chamber. The floor, covered in a layer of dust, crunched faintly beneath her shoes. The walls were lined with strange, ancient symbols that pulsed faintly with an otherworldly light, casting eerie, shifting patterns across the surface. The room felt both ancient and alive, a place where the past and the present seemed to blur together. As she neared the entrance to the passage, Miriam glanced back at the stone altar, its intricate carvings illuminated by the soft light of the pendant. The altar stood as a silent witness to the mysteries that lay hidden within the chamber, its surface covered in symbols that seemed to hold secrets of a bygone era. The pendant's glow reflected off the altar, highlighting the delicate patterns etched into the stone. The passageway, now illuminated by the pendant's light, stretched into the darkness, its narrow confines beckoning her to venture further. The air was cooler here, carrying a faint, musty odor that spoke of age and neglect. The walls of the passage were rough and uneven, their surface covered in a thin layer of dust and grime. The narrow space seemed to close in around her as she moved forward, the flickering light from the orbs casting strange shadows on the walls. Miriam pressed on, her footsteps echoing faintly in the confined space. The passage twisted and turned, leading her deeper into the earth. The walls seemed to shift and change, the markings and symbols becoming more intricate and elaborate as she progressed. The glow from the pendant cast a soft light on the symbols, revealing their intricate details and the strange, shifting patterns they formed. The passage seemed to go on forever, the darkness growing more profound with each step. The air became colder, the chill seeping into her bones as she continued her journey. The vibrations from earlier had returned, a faint, irregular pulsing that seemed to resonate through the walls of the passage. It was as if the very earth was alive, its energy flowing through the confined space. After what felt like hours, the passage opened up into a vast, cavernous space. The room was enormous, its ceiling lost in shadow and its walls lined with strange, ancient symbols that glowed faintly in the darkness. The floor was uneven, dotted with crumbling debris and the remnants of long-forgotten artifacts. The air was thick with the scent of decay and age, a musty odor that clung to the darkness. The cavern was eerily silent, the only sound the distant, echoing drip of water from an unseen source. Miriam's footsteps reverberated through the space, the noise amplified by the cavern's vastness. The pendant's light cast a soft, warm glow on the surrounding walls, revealing the intricate symbols and markings that adorned the cavern's surface. In the center of the cavern stood a large, circular structure, its surface covered in strange, glowing runes. The structure was ancient, its surface worn smooth by the passage of time. The runes pulsed gently, their light casting an eerie illumination on the surrounding area. The structure seemed to hum with a faint, resonant energy, the vibrations echoing through the cavern. Miriam approached the structure cautiously, her eyes scanning the runes for any sign of meaning or purpose. The runes were familiar, their patterns resembling those she had seen on the altar and in the passage. They seemed to form a complex, interlocking pattern, a web of symbols that hinted at an underlying structure. As she studied the runes, the pendant's light flickered and dimmed, casting strange shadows on the walls. The cavern seemed to come alive with a faint, rhythmic hum, the vibrations growing stronger and more pronounced. The air felt charged with energy, the warmth of the pendant contrasting sharply with the coldness of the cavern. Miriam reached out and touched the surface of the structure, her fingers brushing against the glowing runes. The moment her skin made contact, a shiver ran through her body, the vibrations intensifying as the structure seemed to respond to her presence. The runes glowed brighter, their light pulsing in time with the rhythmic hum of the cavern. The structure seemed to shift and change beneath her touch, the runes rearranging themselves into new patterns. The light grew more intense, casting long, flickering shadows on the walls of the cavern. The rhythmic hum became a steady, resonant thrum, filling the space with a palpable sense of energy. Miriam stepped back, her heart racing as the structure continued to respond to her presence. The vibrations were almost deafening now, the hum resonating through her entire body. The cavern seemed to shake, the ground trembling beneath her feet as the energy from the structure intensified. The runes on the structure formed a new pattern, a complex, interlocking design that seemed to pulse with an almost sentient energy. The symbols shifted and changed, their meanings elusive and indecipherable. The light from the pendant flickered erratically, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. As the vibrations grew stronger, Miriam felt a sudden, overwhelming sensation of weightlessness. The cavern seemed to dissolve around her, the darkness swirling and shifting as if it were alive. The rhythmic hum of the structure became a deafening roar, filling her senses and drowning out all other sound. And then, without warning, the energy from the structure surged outward, a powerful wave of force that rippled through the cavern. The ground shook violently, the walls trembling as the cavern seemed to expand and contract with the force of the energy. The light from the pendant flickered and dimmed, swallowed by the overwhelming brightness of the surge. Miriam was thrown backward, her body propelled through the air as the energy enveloped her. The sensation of weightlessness intensified, the darkness swirling around her as if she were falling through a vast, infinite void. The roar of the energy filled her senses, the vibrations resonating through her entire being. The surge of energy continued to grow, the force of the wave expanding outward from the structure. The cavern seemed to ripple and distort, the walls and ceiling warping as the energy flowed through the space. The light from the pendant was consumed by the brightness of the surge, leaving Miriam in complete darkness. As the energy reached its peak, the vibrations and the roar suddenly ceased. The cavern fell into an eerie silence, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Miriam's body felt heavy, her limbs numb as she lay on the ground. The cold of the cavern seemed to return, the warmth of the energy replaced by a deep, pervasive chill. Slowly, she pushed herself to her feet, her movements sluggish and unsteady. The cavern was still and quiet, the vibrations and the roar of the energy gone. The structure in the center of the room was dim, its runes flickering weakly as if exhausted by the surge. The light from the pendant had returned, casting a soft, warm glow on the surroundings. Miriam took a deep breath, the air cold and crisp as she scanned the cavern. The walls were once again covered in the strange, glowing symbols, but the patterns had shifted, their meanings even more elusive than before. The floor was littered with debris, the remnants of the earlier surge scattered across the space. The energy had left a mark on the cavern, a palpable sense of change that hung in the air. The vibrations had ceased, but the echoes of the surge lingered, a faint hum that resonated through the space. The cavern felt different now, as if it had been altered by the force of the energy. Miriam moved cautiously through the cavern, her footsteps echoing softly in the silence. The pendant's light illuminated the way, revealing the changes that had occurred in the wake of the surge. The strange symbols on the walls seemed to pulse with a new energy, their patterns shifting and changing as if reacting to the events that had transpired. As she explored the cavern, Miriam felt a sense of unease. The surge of energy had been overwhelming, its force a reminder of the ancient power that lay hidden within the earth. The cavern was no longer the same place it had been before, its atmosphere altered by the events of the past moments. The sense of foreboding grew stronger as she moved through the space, the changes in the cavern adding to her apprehension. The energy from the structure had left its mark, a reminder of the power that lay hidden beneath the surface. The cavern was a place of ancient forces and forgotten mysteries, its secrets waiting to be uncovered. With a final glance at the altered chamber, Miriam turned and made her way back toward the passageway. The path was still illuminated by the pendant's light, the faint glow casting long shadows on the walls. The cavern's atmosphere felt heavier now, the sense of change and the lingering echoes of the surge pressing in on her from all sides. As she walked through the passage, her thoughts were consumed by the events of the past moments. The energy from the structure, the surge of power, and the changes in the cavern all pointed to something greater, something hidden and powerful. The pendant in her hand was a tangible link to the mysteries of the cavern, a key to understanding the forces at play. Miriam's journey through the cavern had only just begun. The changes that had occurred were a reminder of the ancient power that lay hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered. The cavern was a place of secrets and unknown forces, and her exploration had only scratched the surface of the mysteries that lay within. Chapter 12. The Awakening. Miriam emerged from the narrow passage, her steps slow and deliberate as she made her way back through the winding corridors of the ancient labyrinth. The pendant, now a steady and unwavering source of light, illuminated her path, casting a warm glow on the surrounding walls. The cavern's energy had left her feeling both invigorated and unsettled, a powerful reminder of the forces that lay beneath the surface. The passage seemed to stretch endlessly, its walls lined with the same intricate symbols that had guided her journey so far. The faint hum of energy from earlier still resonated faintly in the background, a lingering echo of the powerful surge she had experienced. The air was cooler here, the oppressive heat of the cavern replaced by a refreshing chill. Miriam's breath formed small, misty clouds as she exhaled, the cold air a stark contrast to the warmth of the energy that had filled the cavern. As she walked, her gaze was drawn to the shifting patterns of light on the walls, the symbols casting eerie, flickering shadows. The glow from the pendant reflected off the markings, revealing their intricate details and the strange, fluid movements of the symbols. The passage seemed to shift and change as she moved, the walls undulating and warping in response to the energy that flowed through the space. After what felt like an eternity, Miriam reached the chamber she had encountered earlier, the room with the stone altar. The once familiar sight was now transformed, the atmosphere heavy with the residual energy from the surge. The altar stood in the center of the room, its surface still covered in the intricate carvings and symbols that had been illuminated by the pendant's light. The runes on the pillars surrounding the altar pulsed gently, their glow a soft, rhythmic illumination that filled the space. Miriam approached the altar cautiously, her eyes scanning the surface for any changes. The symbols seemed to have rearranged themselves, forming new patterns that were both mesmerizing and enigmatic. The pendant's light cast a warm glow on the carvings, revealing their intricate details and the shifting movements of the symbols. The energy from the earlier surge had left a mark on the altar, the carvings now pulsating with a subtle, rhythmic vibration. She reached out and placed her hand on the surface of the altar, her fingers brushing against the glowing symbols. The moment her skin made contact, the energy from the altar surged through her, a powerful wave of force that resonated through her entire being. The vibrations were strong, almost overwhelming, as the altar responded to her touch. The symbols glowed more brightly, their light intensifying as if reacting to her presence. The room seemed to come alive with energy, the vibrations resonating through the walls and floor. The once dimly lit space was now illuminated by the pulsing light from the altar, the patterns on the walls shifting and changing in response to the surge of power. The air was charged with a palpable sense of energy, the warmth from the pendant contrasting sharply with the cold of the cavern. As the energy from the altar continued to flow through her, Miriam felt a profound sense of connection to the ancient forces that had been awakened. The vibrations were both exhilarating and disorienting, a reminder of the power that lay hidden within the earth. The pendant's light flickered and danced, casting strange shadows on the walls as the energy surged through the chamber. Miriam withdrew her hand from the altar, the energy subsiding as she pulled away. The room fell into a hushed silence, the vibrations and the pulsing light fading as the energy dissipated. The atmosphere was still heavy with the residual power, the air thick with the sense of change that had occurred. She took a deep breath, the cool air filling her lungs as she surveyed the transformed chamber. The altar's carvings had returned to their previous state, the symbols once again illuminated by the soft glow of the pendant. The runes on the pillars continued to pulse gently, their light a steady, rhythmic presence in the otherwise quiet room. With a final glance at the altar, Miriam turned and made her way back through the passage, the faint glow of the pendant guiding her path. The journey through the labyrinth had been long and arduous, but the discoveries she had made were both profound and unsettling. The ancient forces that lay hidden within the earth had been awakened, their power a reminder of the mysteries that still remained. As she walked, her thoughts were consumed by the events of the past moments. The energy from the altar, the surge of power, and the changes in the cavern had all pointed to something greater, something hidden and powerful. The pendant in her hand was a tangible link to the forces she had encountered, a key to understanding the mysteries that lay beneath the surface. The passage seemed to stretch on endlessly, the walls lined with the same intricate symbols that had guided her journey. The glow from the pendant provided a comforting light, casting long shadows on the walls and revealing the shifting patterns of the symbols. The faint hum of energy from earlier still resonated in the background, a lingering reminder of the powerful forces that lay hidden within the earth. Miriam's steps were measured and deliberate, each footfall echoing softly through the passage. The air was cooler here, the oppressive heat of the cavern replaced by a refreshing chill. The sense of change and the lingering echoes of the energy created an atmosphere of anticipation, as if something significant was about to occur. After what felt like hours, Miriam reached the end of the passage, the familiar sight of the entrance to the surface coming into view. The light from the pendant flickered and danced, casting a warm, reassuring glow on the surroundings. The air outside was crisp and cool, the contrast to the cavern's oppressive heat a welcome relief. As she emerged into the open air, Miriam felt a profound sense of relief and accomplishment. The journey through the labyrinth had been both challenging and enlightening, a journey into the heart of an ancient power that lay hidden beneath the surface. The pendant in her hand was a reminder of the mysteries she had uncovered, a key to understanding the forces that had been awakened. The surface world seemed both familiar and strange, the sunlight a stark contrast to the darkness of the cavern. The landscape was tranquil, a serene reminder of the world she had left behind during her journey. The pendant's light was a steady presence, its warm glow a comforting reminder of the ancient forces that still lay hidden within the earth. Miriam stood at the edge of the entrance, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The journey through the labyrinth had been only the beginning, a prelude to the deeper mysteries that lay beyond. The forces she had encountered were a reminder of the power that lay hidden beneath the surface, a testament to the ancient knowledge that had been uncovered. With a final glance at the cavern entrance, Miriam turned and began her ascent back to the surface. The path was familiar, the light from the pendant guiding her way. The journey had been long and arduous, but the discoveries she had made were both profound and unsettling. As she emerged into the daylight, the world seemed to open up before her, the sky a vast expanse of blue. The surface world was a reminder of the life she had left behind, a stark contrast to the darkness of the cavern. The pendant in her hand was a tangible link to the ancient forces she had encountered, a key to understanding the mysteries that lay hidden within the earth. Miriam's journey was far from over. The forces she had awakened and the mysteries she had uncovered were only the beginning. The ancient knowledge and the hidden power that lay beneath the surface were waiting to be explored, a testament to the enduring mysteries of the earth. The path ahead was uncertain, but the journey into the heart of the unknown had only just begun.